Yeah, the one thing that I can't stand the most is these Daniel Wellington style copies that say we're cutting out the middleman, we're going straight to the supplier, and we're sharing the profits with you. That's not even, get out of here. That's not even true, right? Welcome to another episode of Breaking It Down. Today we're going to talk about how to build a microbrand watch. So first, what puts me on the playing field of being able to talk on this video, I'm going to give a bit of background and a story, pretty funny one. So when I first started the company, I just started wearing watches. I never wore a watch. I played sports growing up and just always found watches to be quite inconvenient. But at one point, I tore the ligaments of my knee, I tore the ligaments of my other knee. At the hospital, realizing one knee surgery won't stop me. Two knee surgeries won't stop me. Nothing's gonna stop me. Ugh. And you got to give up on your athletic ambitions at some point, I think, for most people. So that's when it was for me. And I started wearing a watch. I just started really falling in love with the complexities of what a watch was and how many different components there were and the way that the movement worked and the quality of the strap. And there's just so many moving pieces. And I just really started to enjoy making them, wearing them, and then from that making them. And so when we started Morpho, some of our first customers off Kickstarter were watch brands. And so we rode that, right? We really started picking up a lot of watch brands. I think probably in the history of the company, we've manufactured for over 50 brands. Not 100, but somewhere between 50 and 100. Some of that's just samples, right? Some of that is, probably 10 of those are customers that we've had since the beginning of the company and have kept them till now, right, where we're doing mass production for it. So there's a wide spectrum of different brands that we've done, right? At the beginning, we were doing a lot of quartz movements, battery operated watches, but those are quite cheap. They're quite easy to make, and it's not as exciting, right? The movement to me is really, it's the engine, right? It's what makes a watch so interesting. So we started moving in to making some complex watches, and that's basically the majority of what we do now. Higher end, right? Higher factory prices per unit, lower quantities, but really focusing on creating, the Rolls Royces or the Rolexes of the niche. So, Rolex in this case, because it's watches. China has come a long way. Right before COVID, I went to Switzerland to the IWC, the watch factory. I met with one of the managers on the floor and talked to him for quite some time and showed him one of the watches that I had that we had made in China. I didn't tell him it was made in China. And he said, "Oh, wow, this is great. Where did you make it?" And I told him China, and he was surprised, almost in a bad way, right? China's become quite competitive. Switzerland's sending less movements to China, right? It's going to come to a head. Not now, right? That's a very old industry. China certainly can't get there overnight. But I would say in the coming decades, the improvement in Chinese watch manufacturing is just going to continue to skyrocket to the point. Right now, I'm confident that in China, you can make a watch of similar quality to any watch in the world outside of crazy, fancy aesthetic design changes, outside of movements. But for like a solid quality watch, it's getting very close. So take a step back, I'll tell you a bit of a story. So one of my first customers when I started the business was my friend Ryan. He's a founder of a company called Original Grain. And we went to the factory and they had made a watch completely wrong. The colors were off. It was just wrong. It had gold on it. And instead of being like a nice, calm gold that's not too flashy, it looked like Iron Man gold. And I think they even went on to sell it as the Iron Man watch after this story. I went to the factory, right? Ryan didn't speak Chinese. I went to the factory to help negotiate. And I basically, not to get into too many details because it's obviously kind of private, but we just tried to negotiate to say, look, let's figure out, what we can do, discount, whatever. We're here to make a new order. They didn't agree. They disagreed. They wanted us to pay everything. So bad that, in fact, we ended up getting locked. They shut the door of the parking lot for the factory. They wouldn't let us leave. So our driver was in the parking lot and the car was locked in the factory and we couldn't leave. We ended up having to go to the police station, and it was just a long, ridiculous, brutal day. Finally, we ended up paying and got out of there. And obviously, Brian never worked with them again. But it was just a crazy, this, like, is this actually happening type of story? It just didn't seem like it was possible. And to be honest, I don't even know, obviously it would have been approached differently. Before you're making a PO, before you're putting in the order, you're going to have everything contractually set up much different. I know that I learned a lot that day. I'm sure he did too. But it really allowed me to take another look at the way we were doing watches and to start figuring out how to break it up. So I've got a list of questions here, but I'll start by saying the most important thing is to use something similar to Morpho's component control method, where you're working with specialized factories to make specialized components and then assembling somewhere else. Because most of the time you go on Alibaba, you find a watch factory, they'll only make the case, right? They'll only do the assembly. They're not going to have, for the most part, they're not going to have an integrated vertical supply chain where they're making every single component of the watch. They're going to farm out the hands. They're going to farm out the straps. They're going to farm out the packaging, right? And that's just, that's just how watch business works in China. But if you take it back, take some of the control back into your hand as a buyer, you can go and find the best hand supplier. You can go and find the best strap supplier. You can go and find the best case supplier, right? Maybe you want a diving watch that can go 300, 500, even 1,000. I have one watch made in China that has a 2,500 meter depth ability, right? So there's specialists for all this stuff. And if you shop around and if you look properly, you can find them. It's not easy. And getting them to work together is even harder, because when one person makes a component and it doesn't work with the other component, who's to blame, right? So there's obviously a lot of ways that you have to figure out how to do this properly and to have a proper structure to your setup. But I think that is the most important thing, is find the specialist for each component. So I'm working on my own watch brand, which I find very exciting, but obviously that's not my area of expertise. Because I've been manufacturing watches for 50 plus brands, I've seen what works. I've seen what people do that is successful. I've seen what people do that isn't successful. And so hopefully this list of questions will help you. So first question, who is your target market and what type of watch niche are you presenting yourself as? Just pick what you're doing, right? Are you doing a dress watch? Are you doing a diving watch? Tool watch? What are you trying to, is it a quartz watch, right? Are you just trying to do something that is only fashion, only aesthetic, Daniel Wellington? Now, that niche has been beat to death. I don't think it's one that people should pursue unless they have crazy connections or a crazy design. But you got to pick what you're doing and stick to that, right? In the watch game, you can't go too wide. You can't launch with different types of watches at the beginning. Pick what you want and stick with it. Next, what is your USP? It's not good enough to just be, we're making a nice watch, right? What are the materials you're using? What are the movement you're using? What is the design inspiration that you have? So there's a lot of questions there. And I think now too often people think, I'm making a new watch, I'm going to use some space rock for the dial, right? That was really cool. I had some good friends that we actually manufactured for too that did that at the beginning of that trend, and it was very successful. But I don't think just using some material for your dial that's different than other people is enough anymore. You have to really create a story and create a USP, right? A unique selling proposition. What about your watch makes it different? What about your watch makes it stand out from a very busy industry? Yeah, the one thing that I can't stand the most is these Daniel Wellington style copies that say we're cutting out the middleman, we're going straight to the supplier, and we're sharing the profits with you. That's not even, get out of here. That's not even true, right? People are just rinse and repeating, copy paste the same type of formula, and it doesn't work anymore, right? You launch a watch campaign like that on Kickstarter, if you don't have the best ad spend team in the planet, you're tanking, right? There's nothing unique. People aren't interested in regurgitated stories. So come up with your new story, come up with your own USP, come up with something unique. The watch industry, especially the microbrand industry, is very open
But it's also very, very crowded in terms of that copy-paste formula. What movement are you going with? For me, this is probably the most important, right? There's, again, like I said, I don't really like using quartz movements. I like using automatic movements. Again, it's the engine, right? It's like getting a really nice car. Having that engine, having the nice movement just makes a world of difference. And so there's a wide variety, there's Chinese automatic movements, but for the most part, you should be sticking with Japanese and Swiss. Normally, like the average, most commonly used movements in the microbrand industry, they're starting to not be as easy to find, and they're starting to be more expensive. So do your research, right? There's a lot of them out there, way too many to go over in one video, certainly. But there's probably like 10 to 20 very commonly used Japanese and Swiss movements in microbrand watches. Do your research, ask around, buy a watch that has the movement you're looking at, see what you think about it. But that decision is an important one that watch collectors will certainly look at when they're, getting ready to buy. What's your price point? This is a tough one, right? Because most micro brands just go $300-400. There's not a lot of thought putting into it because the movement price is very common knowledge. Anyone in that world is going to know how much the movement costs. And then so if your watch doesn't line up with the expectations, people will ask questions. In my opinion, that's a good thing. You want to be able to be a brand that stands out, right? There's been a few brands in the last, let's say, 5 years that have charged a lot more, and people are very happy, right? Because they've done the good work for each of the components to justify a higher price point. So I always think you should go for a higher price point, but if you don't justify it, people are not only going to complain, your brand's going to be tarnished, and you're going to have a tough time selling pieces. Next up, overview of the prototyping process. So it kind of depends at what level you are as creating this watch brand, right? Are you a designer? Have you worked with a designer to come up with files? Are your designs pictures or renderings? Because in the manufacturing process, that's useless. Do you have proper CAD files that you've worked with an engineer? So it kind of depends where you're at in that process. Let's just assume that you have nothing, right? You just have an idea or maybe a sketch. You can find freelancers quite easily. I use Upwork very regularly. We obviously have engineers in-house now, but when I first started going on Upwork, finding a freelancer, posting a really good job, like an application, letting people see what you really want, being very detail oriented, get the design in, get the CAD files, and then work on finding your factory. So this goes back to the component control, right? Making a watch is hard work. You can easily go on Alibaba and find one supplier that will give you a quote, probably a cheap one, and say they can make it. Good luck with that. Seriously, it's just not going to happen. Watches are too complex. There's too much of a money grab. There's not enough value provided by these trading companies, right? That's the type of people that are going to lock you up in the factory, speaking from experience. So either break it down. Obviously, coming to China would be ideal, but breaking it down to the components, really trying to understand each of the processes involved in manufacturing, and then setting up with them, getting a quote and prototyping. I would expect most people want to get it right on the first try. Again, good luck with that. It's not going to happen. Expect for a few rounds of prototypes. What I would do with a new brand, obviously now our supply chain is pretty intact and we know who we're working with when it comes to different components. But if I were making a brand from scratch, I would work with a few different factories and be willing to put down, how much is your time worth, right? Pay for 3 rounds of separate prototypes with 3 separate factories. It's better to get one of them right than go through 3 different factories and spend, 18 months of your life and never having your watch on point. So invest a bit, right? Are you serious about this? Invest a bit, get it right, put in the time, and I think you'll get a result that you're happy with. That's obviously a very complex process. I'm doing my best here. Typical MOQ requirements. Probably they'll start with 500, but if you're making a watch with a nice movement that costs $200, you can probably bring it down to 300, and then break down, 100 or 200, 150 maybe per SKU, per color, right? So you could do one watch, one model, and then have it broken into 2 colors. You could probably pull off 300, depends who you're working with and depends on the price. I would aim for 500, but 300 is certainly possible. What's the most overdone fad you want to see disappear from the watch industry? I already touched on this. Anything related to Daniel Wellington, right? That brand, good for them. They're huge. They've made millions and millions of dollars. But it's crap. It's a crap watch, right? We've made so many watches similar to that. They're cheap. The movements are bad. They're not long lasting. Sure, they look good with a button-up shirt if you're going to work. But they're so overdone. There's nothing new. I don't even really know what you could do new to change anything within that trend. I just think it's so boring. Goodbye to that one. What do you think is an overlooked niche design material? Well, for me personally, I'm a pretty big guy. I like wearing bigger watches, but most of the watches that are like 44 millimeters across the case or up are shiny and ugly and blingy, right? I think there's a big opportunity for bigger cases with a refined, clean look. All right, that's it. That's my advice on how I build a micro brand watch. If you are, feel free to reach out. Please hit subscribe for any more news from us, and we'll talk to you next time. Peace.